Hi learners, welcome back. Today is lecture number 32 and I am going to discuss how disability is represented in mass media. Now, I am going to be borrowing from the article written by Nukaraju Bendukurthi and Usha Raman in 2016, which is titled Framing Disability in the Indian News Media, a Political Economy Analysis of Representation. So, in the previous lecture, we discussed how Africans are represented in mass media, particularly in Western mass media, and in today's lecture, we will be talking about how concerns of disability are represented in the Indian news media. So, let us begin by talking about how the amount and nature of disability representation in English and Telugu news media, which Raman and Bendukurthi discuss in terms of serving neoliberal objectives. The neoliberal economy is something that we have been discussing throughout this course, and it is also important to think about when we are thinking about representations of disability. The disability construction in the Indian print news media, it may be actually seen as a product of how representation becomes a political economy. And the news articles, they present disabled people as having use value in society. Very, very important that we think of the disabled as having use value, which is ready to be offered for exchange value in the market, and that is why they should be treated well is something which is portrayed. These insights are derived from what they would call a close reading of news articles using framing analysis. This is the analysis that they follow, which allowed them to explore the political economy of disability coverage in mainstream news. Now, this is the idea that the authors are bringing in, where they are going to see how disability is represented in news articles. And their study, it situates the symbolic economic relations which are established through the media, consciously placing disability representation within the existing discourses related to disability. What they also do is re-evaluate the available themes on disability and media representation, primarily to again see how disability is represented in print news in India. The policies and the politics associated with disability news production in the Indian print media are uncovered and understood through the use of specific journalistic devices which are called news frames. And what they attempt is also to analyze different news frames within which disability is itself constructed and the strategic ways in which it is employed to represent disability. Globally, there is a long tradition of looking at disability representation in media, with film and literature being primary loci of the study, and news and other mass media receive less attention. Much of the work done so far has been done on Western media, with very few published reports from the developing world. The literature on disability representation suggests that stories in newspapers, as has been written about by several scholars, on television and in feature length films, they impact public attitudes. And this is why when we think about representation, we need to have a sociological perspective, primarily because representation has an impact on public attitude. The media constructions, they have the potential to influence and shape the perceptions and thereby the attitudes of the audiences towards disability. And a very similar argument was made with respect to gender as well, when we were thinking about how gender representations are important. Media representations of disability are important in two ways. First, in shaping ideas and attitudes towards people with disabilities, and the second is creating and establishing a sense of participation of people with disabilities in the larger social world. So, the first is to basically depict and bring attitudes and ideas. The second is ensure participation. Previous work has noted the predominance of conceptions as prejudiced depiction of disability. Many disabled characters are represented through prejudiced lenses. They are also objectified, the characters being objectified. This portrayed as crude, one dimensional and also simplistic. it also points to the presence of a kind of ableist language and describes disability representation as mascotization. Now, what this entails is that there is a desire and a need to shift away from these kinds of representations. Now, Jenny Morris contends that cultural depictions of disability in media are more often than not about the sentiments of able-bodied individuals and their responses to disability rather than disability itself. This is a very important point to make, that the way disability is portrayed is generally about able-bodied people and their responses rather than disability itself. Morris concludes primarily from Laura Mulvey's work, which we had discussed in terms of the male gaze in the feminist approach to understanding media, which suggests that disability representation in media occurs via the gaze of non-disabled or able-bodied people. So, if male gaze is about bringing in the masculine perspective, the disability gaze is about the non-disabled or able-bodied. This prejudice, it structures the news articles that is produced, and drawing upon this premise, the author's study, it focuses on the process and dynamics that underpin disability representation in Indian news media, and therefore, the study wants to look at how disability is represented in the Indian print media. So, a representation is linked to the concept of ideology, and we have been discussing that, which means that every society ensures a maintenance of its existence, its institutions and structures by getting people to accept a particular way of thinking. And this is why stereotypes become important in terms of how the world itself is represented. Representation is actually defining reality in a particular way, as it is also about social power. So, when the Africans are represented as incompetent, greedy, uncivilized, it is also social power exerted by the Western mass media. Therefore, representation actually becomes a huge site of social struggle, and this is something that we have been discussing throughout this module, that how people want to be represented in the media is also a reflection of their social position. Now, several media scholars have argued that media representations are selective, and this is something that we have been discussing again and again in this unit, where journalists generally use a small amount of information from the large collection of data that exists, so that what emerges then in the media narrative is a very small slice of a large reality. And this is something which happens because the representations reflect social power. Representations are mediated, again important because audiences have a prior awareness of the genres and the contents, for example, fiction programs and comedy shows, and how they would be perceived by the audience. The Western media studies literature abounds with examples that argue about these points, and their literature search revealed that no systematic studies of disability representation existed in the Indian news media. Given media's pervasiveness in our lives, it is actually logical to assume that media helps in shaping the sense of our social world, and it includes our understanding of specific social groups, attributes assigned to them, etc. And a lot of work in the Indian context as well as globally have been around stereotypes of women and how media representations work to maintain the status quo for these groups. Some of these works which we have already discussed throughout this course. The present study is informed by the social model of disability, which establishes a conceptual framework for reading disability as a social outcome and also something which happens because of social repression. It emphasizes analysis of the elements which increase the difficulties and affect the life capacities of individuals who possess physical disability. Modes of representation primarily are also seen as possibilities related to disability and those who identify as persons with disability. In many ways, disability is not only biological, it is also social, and the social nature of disability needs to be focused more. So, given the media's enormous presence in India and the level of awareness, commitment and sense of responsibility that should exist towards disability issues, that hasn't really happened. And what we primarily need is also a strong critique of the media's role in conveying many stereotypes, myths and misconceptions about disability. Holler has noted that newspaper narratives have a history of ignoring, devaluing or misrepresenting the disability issues, and this might be true of disability representation in the Indian media context also. Which is why media organizations across the world, they share the propensity for ableist narratives, and therefore, persons with disabilities are presented as people with little worth. In order to study how disability is represented in the Indian news media, they draw upon material in two major newspapers published in the Telugu speaking region, the Hindu and Inadu. Inadu is published in Telugu and the Hindu is published in English. Articles were selected from the main section of each paper and featured in special interest supplements, and special editions were not included as the focus was on news items. Now, interestingly, disability related news features which appeared on any page of the main paper were included. Both the selected papers have been recognized for their wide ranging coverage and high circulation in the Telugu speaking region. They have also had a history of recruiting persons with disabilities to work in various capacities. That is why when one looks at this method of doing content analysis and discourse analysis, you can see that there is a conscious attempt at choosing sites which can offer this diversity. The stories selected included all news stories published offline in these two newspapers in the calendar year 2012, as the study was published in 2016, and it was expected that there would be substantial coverage related to disability because it was also the year of the Para Olympics, especially in the sports section of the newspapers. Now, the frame analysis was applied as a tool to identify stories as well as uncover the representational meanings and strategies. The frame, it refers to a rhetorical and discursive device which forces or encourages a certain reading of the text. It is a kind of methodological analytical tool. Frame elements or elements which constitute the frame, it includes both verbal and design elements. So, you have the importance on this verbal as well as the design elements. And in this article, the authors, they consider for analysis not only the text of a news story, but also basically additional elements like the design and the use of images, etc. The study analyzed 205 news stories on disability by first selecting them through key terms and then examining each across dimensions like origin, placement, length, source and content type. And they then did a very close reading of these stories, through which four major themes emerged. Number one is goodwill building, number two economism, persistence of the medical model and statism or anti-statism. The analysis, it combined macro level attention to headlines and overall narratives with the micro level scrutiny of language, quotes and rhetorical strategies. It distinguishes between the themes which are also recurring patterns of meaning across stories. The media serves as a bridge between traditionally marginalized groups and society as well as the market. In this context, journalists often bear the responsibility of basically creating demand for and acceptance of persons with disabilities. Recent studies have also suggested that disability media presentations serve to promote the idea that correcting impairments with the use of technology or medical intervention can transform disability into specific abilities which can be utilized by the market, which is why the focus on neoliberal economy. Several news stories were seen to emphasize this aspect, where they were looking at how disabled people could be value added to the economy. These messages are constructed in a manner which builds society's goodwill towards the persons with disabilities. The goodwill building, it occurs in the news presentations either through the usage of very evocative or emotional language, compelling images, or effective use of frame elements. The language also, it connects with the charity frame, where the people with disabilities are portrayed as people who need our goodwill. So, they shift the focus from the idea of disability to one of capability or also readiness to become part of the workspace. So, goodwill is built through an idea that the disabled are valuable. It is their value which makes them essential for the society. So, the media, it appears that it negotiates with society on behalf of the PWDs to make productive use of their bodies and their labor. So, this can also be read as the media, which itself is a private or a capitalist entity, helping the industrial or corporate world by identifying this labor with a value suitable for productivity. It primarily sends a message that PWDs are socially acceptable because they can also be seen as a reserve army of labor, as Karl Marx would argue, or a protective group which await their turn to be incorporated into the market. Newspapers are not only vehicles of information dissemination, they also function as agents of the market economy. News displays PWD's achievements or public consumption with the expectation of building awareness of their availability and readiness for utilization as human capital. It's very important that people with disabilities also show their worthiness to be seen as people who deserve our empathy or goodwill, because if they are not human capital or human resource, then they are not worth it. News stories such as these use the achievements of disabled people to position them in a positive light. Media performs a gatekeeping job which scrutinizes their achievements and then presents them to the people. One can discern a market ideology or strategy behind this emphasis on their abilities. So, essentially one could also argue that such feature stories tend to commodify the abilities of the disabled people. So, you will be accepted, you will be valued as a disabled if you have a particular value to your labor and you are able to achieve. Now, gaining favorable media coverage which highlights achievements is also similar to sending one's resume to the whole world, because it announces that they are ready to offer the use of their abilities for exploitation in this new liberal capitalist economy. The media narrative, it leads one to see the overcoming of disability as a major and sometimes the ultimate achievement. The final effect is to romanticize both the disability and how the person conquers or basically beats that disability. Resilience is something which is celebrated in the neoliberal economy, and disability is also not outside it. Many special interest stories as defined within their study, they differ slightly from the feature stories. Features focus on the individual, whereas the special interest stories, they center on the significance of the achievements of an entire group of people. These stories generally are shorter and they are placed within the news space, but they are set apart in boxes. Players with different forms and levels of disability showed their mettle in 3-day South Zone cricket tournament. So, this is a headline published in 2012 in the Hindu, which show again how disability is portrayed as some form of a barrier that people are overcoming. Goodwill building narratives are like advertisements, and they serve to let potential sponsors and donors and employers know about the value that PWD people, persons with disabilities, will bring into the job market. So, essentially these same news photos, they also increase the physical differences of the persons with disabilities, such as one that is enlarged or zoomed in on the particular impairment to make their body appear even smaller than their impairment. Interestingly, the focus is on basically representation of the disabled part. Such presentations have been seen in the beginning of the 20th century as the poster child phenomena, which was otherwise labeled as charity advertising. This advertising shifts from the traditional purpose of seeking help to seeking economic opportunities on behalf of the persons with disabilities. So, one can see that there is a practice of including the roles that PWDs could play, drawing upon their abilities. So, while these stories may take a promotional tone, they work to build social acceptance for the PWDs. The second theme is economism, where disability is seen as a form of poverty which generates an attitude of pity or sympathy directed at their state of impairment. Social construction of disability limits its explorations and basically explanations as an economic category, and articles under this theme discussed disabled people as an economic category. Disability as an economic category gets associated with benefit, welfare, financial aid, budget allocations, grants, salaries, etc., where disability is seen as one way of primarily, spending the states as well as corporates budget on development of this category of people. The media presents a position on disability issues and constructs social perspectives in relation to systematic oppression. So, here what happens is that you see that the state exercises a major influence on the everyday economic and social life of the PWDs, having the potential to be both enabling and limiting in its approach. So, there is a lot of focus on the state benefits that it announces and provides from time to time for PWDs. The third is the persistence of the medical model, where the news articles grouped under this category, they suggest that PWDs are medical subjects who could be treated, and it is a condition which is often induced and therefore can be cured. It can be corrected and it can be rehabilitated, it can be reconstructed. What these stories do is reinforce this idea that disability is a medical category by emphasizing on its cure and treatment. Here, the social construction and social ways in which disability take place are not taken into account. The last theme is about statism and anti-statism, where the theme emerges from news stories on disability, primarily sourced from the government and focusing on issues related to their empowerment or employment opportunities, mostly in relation to the implementation of the 3% reservation of jobs in the government sector for the PWDs. These stories included announcements about government incentives, scholarships, policies for persons with disabilities, and then the analysis of their impact on their lives. These articles also allowed the authors to understand the role of citizens and civil society organizations in advocating PWD rights and building pressure on the state through the media. Now, stories in this category also can be seen as reporting decisions or actions of the state and avoiding promotional or advocacy tone. One also sees that news articles which pointed to the persistence of the medical model, they serve to speak on behalf of PWDs for their social integration and enhance life choices or chances through the adoption of what they would call scientific inventions. Now, interestingly, assistive technologies allows people to access the world and acquire new powers, and these inventions are instrumental in their coming out of disabilities. New stories on scientific or medical innovations pacify the anxieties of the able-bodied audience about disability, because it also nullifies their fear that disability cannot be mitigated. These stories serve to emphasize the fact that even in the event a disability occurs, one can avoid the stigma as well as exclusion from productive society. What these stories are doing is also creating basically a hopefulness amongst people that they can be able to mitigate, disability in case it happens to them, unfortunately, because of these inventions. Now, to conclude this lecture on representations of disability, we must remember that a major point of learning from this study that I have discussed is that there is a widespread lack of awareness and orientation to disability issues amongst journalists and newspaper managements, which then impacts also the reading public. an ethical approach to news construction would take into account the sensitivities and needs of all constituencies, particularly among the marginalized groups such as persons with disabilities. And for this to happen, we need more conscious effort to include the missing perspectives of disability groups and integrate PWDs into the process of news production. So, if we are able to have representation of people with disabilities in the news process, there could be ways in which some of these biases are mitigated. So, their analysis, it points to the consequences of an existing gap. The news stories analyzed here, they exhibit a bias in terms of framing disability, perpetuates the medical understanding of disability rather than a more socially situated, nuanced way of seeing people with disabilities. And if news organizations can frame policies which are inclusive in terms of news conceptualization, scope and coverage, giving voice to more PWDs and disability advocates, as well as in terms of hiring practices, drawing in disability viewpoints in the production process, there could be a significant way to lead the change in how we report disability and attitudes are built, most importantly in setting a fair and balanced representation of disability in motion. What I have tried to do through this lecture is present a particular way in which one of the most marginalized groups of the social, which are the persons with disability, are represented in news story, and how these representations have social connections to the world that we live in, and then how there could be better representations with further integration and inclusion of persons with disabilities into the news production system. Thank you.